I guess I will start. And then Gussie, you have an announcement too as well, right?
Correct.
Awesome. Well, I have exciting news because many of you know that we're offering CTAS training here in St. Michael on June 23rd. We have an AM session as well as a PM session. And I just received word this morning that both of those sessions are now full. And so we're glad to hear that there's been a lot of interest in both of those sessions. Um, Knowing that we're already full and it's just June 2nd, we may actually consider having another one as well here over the summer, but stay tuned for that. We're glad to know that people are wanting the CTAS training and both sessions are now completely full. And Gussie has another exciting announcement that she would like to mention.
Thanks, Michael. You bet I
Yeah.
do. We're always looking for something local. That's always seems to be the problem for us is we can't get to where we're going. So we've decided that we're going to start out with what we call neighborhood training. Kind of a fun option for us. What we're going to do is to start out first, and this is going to follow on the heels here of CTAS training. It won't be CTAS training. This is neighborhood clerk treasurer training. Um, it's going to be for new and seasoned clerks too and treasurers, and they can take advantage of this free training session. There will be refresher topics, new information, plus we're going to have a question and answer session. Pre-registration will be required, and you're going to watch for the MAT email to register at mntownships.org website. It's going to be on June 25th, 2026, 9 a.m. to noon at the North Pine Government Center in Sandstone, Minnesota. It's at 1602 MN-23 in Sandstone, and I will add that information into the chat. Good to see you all.
Thanks for that, folks. All right. Uh, then let me go ahead and get into it. All right. Here we go. So today I thought I'd talk a bit about an issue that we haven't covered very much at the association here, and that's this. What happens when you've got something that you don't need anymore and you want to get rid of it? Townships often find themselves in possession of older equipment, stuff that's not functioning anymore, or stuff that is, surplus to requirements. So, sometimes it's still in working condition, sometimes it's not. But what do we do in this particular situation? So I think it's worth returning to first principles here when you think about all of these things. And the most important first principle when being a township officer, or indeed being any sort of elected official, is that public office is a public trust, and the disposal of public property is no exception to this general principle. There's a bunch of potential problems that can flow from doing it wrong, from reputational all the way up to potential legal issues. So I thought we'd just sort of walk through potentially a couple of examples here, and think about how to think about these problems. So say we got an old pickup truck. Say, maybe it's not in the best shape, but it still runs. And not a lot of folks have expressed any interest in this. So one of the supervisors is like, hey, you know what? I'll just take it off of the township's hands. We're gonna give you $500 because this thing barely runs anyway. So thinking through this problem, couple of questions. Is that legal? Can he buy it? What happens? Is there something sort of relevant to this person's status as an officer as opposed to potentially an employee or some other kind of person related to the township? What might we want to know, and what process might we want to go through? Well, obviously, I'm bringing this up, because the legislature has decided to play a bit of hide and seek with us. And here is kind of here's one of the major pieces from my perspective. So it's Minnesota Statute 15.054. No officer or employee of any political subdivision shall sell to any other officer or employee of the subdivision any property or materials owned by the subdivision except pursuant to the conditions provided in this section. Property or materials owned by the subdivision and not needed for public purposes may be sold to an employee after reasonable public notice at public auction or by sealed response if the employee is not directly involved in the auction process pertaining to the administration or collection of sealed responses. Okay, thanks, legislature. As usual, wildly clear here. So let's turn this into something that we can actually use here. So first things first. When I said hide and seek, I meant it in this case. So this one is hiding in the middle of the chapters related to state administration, not something that's usually touched on by townships really in any way, shape, or form, but it does have that kind of supremacy language in it. Cannot sell except pursuant to the conditions provided in this section. So it kind of whatever else you thought you were doing, if you were paging through chapter 365 or 368 or whatever, this one kind of jumps ahead of the queue and says, no, no, you need to do it this way, not another way. There's another big piece to this thing. Did you notice the sleight of hand that the legislature used here? That's maybe a little bit of a bombastic way to put it, but I'm trying to be present accurate material as in the most interesting way possible. And the sleight of hand here is that so we say this thing is the only process that counts, or this process must be complied with regardless of whatever else you think you're doing. And first, they say you cannot sell to any officer or employee. And then they say, except you can sell to an employee. Note they dropped officer. So, that means that we can sell to employees if we do the proper process, but they did not accept officers. So this operates as kind of this weird little backdoor prohibition on officers actually buying anything. Now, naturally, they never actually said officers can't buy property. Instead, they did it this weird sort of backdoory way, but functionally, that is what we're talking about here. Okay, so going back to our example, that means that our hypothetical town supervisor just can't buy this, sort of no matter what, right? However, if we change our example a little bit and we say, all right, he's not a supervisor, instead he's the road maintenance guy, or the handyman, an employee. Likely he can. However, there's a number of bits of process in this thing that are not presented in the clearest way, right? So in terms of what you need to know, so there needs to be, quote, reasonable public notice. And then on top of having reasonable public notice, you have to go through one of two processes, either public auction or by sealed response. On top of that, there are procedural protections for how you work through the actual process of selling things. So the employee can't be directly involved in the auction or collecting or administering sealed responses in any capacity, right? So they have to be sectioned off from this thing. Probably not a particularly big deal if it's the road maintenance guy who's buying an old truck. Might be a bigger deal if you've got an office manager or something something of that sort, right? That person can't be involved at all in any of the collection of responses or the administering of the auction process. And by the way, this allows, or this sort of reinforces in an interesting way this last point. That is, the town can set higher processes if it wants to. And if it does that, the legislature has provided that violation of this statute is a misdemeanor. So even if you didn't quite mean to, if you say, this must be published in the newspaper, this must be, notice must be given at least 1 month in advance, got to be careful with that stuff because they've chosen to incorporate this particular provision by reference. If you screw it up, you've accidentally committed a misdemeanor. You haven't just violated a township policy. So that's something to be pretty careful about. Um, Now, in addition, there's another piece of classic legislative hide and seek that's worth talking about here. Now, I know we've talked about this one in some depth, so I won't really to dive in here, but nevertheless, 471.87, we've got ourselves our conflict of interest penalty here. So relevant to us, though, um, shall not voluntarily have a personal financial interest is broader than just the sort of the usual stuff we talk about. Now, every time I do that conflict of interest training, I almost always focus specifically on, how is it that we get paid for doing some additional contracting work for the town? Getting benefiting personally financially is not limited to situations in which the town is directly paying the officer. It can include stuff like getting certain goods at arguably at below market rates, right? So likely this is operating as an independent bar on officers purchasing town property under most circumstances. You just want to be very careful. And from our perspective, I think the best interpretation of these two things together is that town officers just can't buy town property. Um, okay. Another weird little sort of backwards one, or at least it's backwards from the way that we usually think about it, is in 471.345. So subdivision 2, which sort of defines this is uniform municipal contracting law, subdivision 2 kind of defines what a contract is. We almost always talk about this in terms of the town being the one to purchase, but the definition is actually bigger than that, right? So a contract means an agreement entered into by a municipality, including a township, for not just the purchase, but also the sale of supplies, materials, equipment, or the rental thereof, construction, alteration, repair, or maintenance of personal property. What does that mean? It means that the three classic contracting levels also apply to situations in which the town is selling something. So, if you're dealing with relatively low value personal property, you've got your nice little open market there where you just kind of get to do as you like. You're supposed to try to get two written quotes, but um, very little process is required. Number two, our second level. At least two written quotes or the sealed bid process, and then above $175,000, full sealed bidding process can apply. Now, if you think about that, that actually amounts to a weird little backdoor requirement, a procedural requirement in order to do sales. That is, you need to have a good faith estimate for the value of the property before you sell it. So otherwise, you don't know what level of process to be applying to this thing. Once again, in this context, the legislature clearly hasn't, well, that's a little bit too strong. Once again, in this context, the legislature wrote a law in a way that makes you think of it in one direction, but they made it a little broader than they probably meant to, which sort of has these weird little side effects, essentially. So, okay, putting it all together, meaning, you know, so the town has a bit of surplus equipment. We're potentially going to sell it. What about the town fire truck? Well, under almost any circumstances, that thing is going to be worth more than $175,000, meaning Minnesota statute 471.345 is what governs this. So first, we know we cannot sell it to an officer. And second, we know that we have to conduct this sale in a very particular manner. If the amount of the contract is estimated to exceed $175,000, sealed bids shall be solicited by public notice in the manner and subject to the requirements of the law governing contracts by the particular municipality or class thereof. That is, we have to do public notice and we have to do sealed bids. Okay. It's my job to try to help reduce the costs of compliance whenever I can. And so in this particular context, I always like to bring up this little subdivision here. So subdivision 17 is a nice little escape hatch if you're dealing with something like this. Notwithstanding any other procedural requirements of this section, that is the Uniform Municipal Contracting Law. A municipality may contract to sell supplies, materials, and equipment which is surplus, obsolete, or unused using an electronic selling process in which purchasers compete to purchase the supplies, materials, or equipment thereof at the highest purchase price. Okay. So this is what I like to call the eBay exception, meaning you can sell the thing on eBay. So first, you need to make a determination that the supplies or that the thing is supplies, materials, or equipment, because that exception doesn't cover everything that's covered by municipal contracting law. Like once again, they've sort of switched terms in the middle of the law without making a great big deal of it. They don't highlight that anyway. But of course, in any situation in which we're selling stuff, this is likely to cover it, right? Because the other sorts of contracts are things like, alteration of real property, right? So that's not. But just so you know, have that little antenna up that this language is not completely cover the municipal contracting law. Anyway, so first you have you have to determine that the thing you're doing is selling supplies, materials, or equipment, and then it has to be either surplus, obsolete, or unused. Then once you've got those determinations in your hand, there are two additional procedural hurdles here. So you have to sell it using an electronic selling process, which is not particularly defined in statute, but it also has to be in which purchasers must, quote, compete, unquote, to buy at the highest purchase price in an open and interactive environment. So we're not limited to specifically to eBay. You know, having checked on these things a little bit, there are auctioneers who run public auctions in an electronic environment. Something like that probably would count. So you don't specifically have to use eBay, but the critical piece is that it has to be electronic, it has to be open, and it has to be a situation where it's competitive. So anybody can get up and try to buy the thing, and then the highest price wins. So that is once if you have all of those things together, you can sell it, and you don't have to go through the processes of uniform municipal contracting law. Okay, now that is a bunch of process related to selling. Is there some way to deal with this stuff that doesn't require us to go through all of this hassle? And sort of. So Minnesota Statute 471.85 says any town or other, public corporation may transfer personal property for a nominal or without consideration to another public corporation for public use when duly authorized by its governing body. So if you found a situation where there's personal property that you want to get rid of and you don't want to have to deal with this process, you do have a potential tool in the toolkit here. Now we have very little interpretation of this particular section from Minnesota courts. I wasn't able to find a single published case dealing with this thing. So we recourse to the opinions of the Attorney General. For those of you who've been following these trainings over time, the opinion of the Attorney General in the state of Minnesota is not law. Nevertheless, it offers a bit of safe harbor here, right? It's something to rely upon, potentially something to point to if you ever get hauled in front of the court to say, "Hey, look, this wasn't me just making that stuff up. I was relying on the Attorney General's opinion on this." And courts will indeed regard this as persuasive authority that they will tend to follow if they are able to do it. And we've got a nice little opinion here talking about what, quote, personal property, unquote, means in this case. And in this case, something pretty spectacular, right? County could properly transfer road equipment purchased out of county road and bridge funds to town for maintenance of town roads. So, even some maintenance equipment, this is an older case, 1962, but even something as potentially big and important as maintenance equipment is okay to transfer under this particular provision, at least according to the Attorney General of the state of Minnesota. However, it's important to remember that public purpose doctrine applies here. So, every time that we're expending public funds, as indeed we would be in this particular case, When we're giving something of value away to somebody else, we need to make sure that there's some sort of public process, some sort of public purpose attached to that. That is, we're benefiting the citizens of our township somehow by giving this thing away. Now, if you're talking about giving greater or something that you don't particularly need, you wanna upgrade, you can't get rid of the thing another way to a neighboring township, your citizens are potentially using that. There is a safety value in there. So you can justify things in those terms, but just be careful, right? If we end up giving this thing away to a township on the other side of the state, we're going to have a harder time showing that there was a proper public purpose there. Um, so before you get rid of stuff, just a couple of questions potentially to ask here. Do we need this? So we can't give it unless it's surplus, it's obsolete, if it's unused. Um, that's sort of a predicate to all of these different processes. We need to have that first. Second, we need to think about where it is going to. Can't sell to officers really under any circumstances. Couple of prohibitions on that. Some of them are fairly serious. If the county attorney takes a run at the interpreting the conflict of interest provision broadly, you're looking at a gross misdemeanor. If they don't, you're looking at a misdemeanor out of 15.054. So some potential legal consequences attaching to that one. We can sell it to employees, but not to officers. Now, how much is it worth? Third question. So we've got our first two. Now we've got our third. Functionally, we need to have a good faith estimate of its value. Now, municipal contracting law doesn't require us to have an exact dollar figure, or it doesn't require us to have a crystal ball. Rather, we don't have to have perfect knowledge of exactly how much this thing is worth, but we do have to have at least a good faith basis for why it is we think this thing is worth as much as we think. So we can't get around these procedural requirements by calling our $500,000 fire truck something that's worth $100,000, right? And then finally, when you're talking about reputational consequences, I think this test is potentially pretty useful. If this appeared in the front page of the local paper, would our residents believe that it was fair? So that is a good question to potentially be asking yourself. Now, in terms of disposal, there are other best practices that are worth thinking about. These ones are less legal requirements and more just how is it that we public offices, public trust, how do we discharge this in an honest fashion? Um, so maintaining an inventory is potentially something to seriously consider. Now, I know we all have too much work to do. Extra homework is not something that anybody wants to do. However, when you're dealing with township property, memories are fallible. If stuff walks off, it's nice to be able to prove that you actually owned it at one point or another, right? And the best way to do that, it's not like it's impossible. If you're dealing with memories, you can go back into the minutes and you can find examples of purchases. But this is suboptimal for a variety of reasons, because of course there's turnover in the board, there's turnover with employees. Sometimes it can be difficult to remember when exactly we purchased that thing. So finding it in the minutes can be a real pain over time. And then, of course, there's the question of identifying the specific object in question, right? We live in a society where everything is mass manufactured. So did this particular bit of equipment, was that the one we purchased, or was it a different one? So maintaining an inventory where we're keeping track of what specific item is ours and where specifically it is supposed to be is kind of having mercy on your future self. And it's having mercy on future boards. Um, Another set of best practices related to disposal is just on the practical side, right? Some items require extra steps to dispose of. Now, the classic case here is forgetting to wipe a phone or a hard drive before you sell it or before you give it away. Now, those things are going to just by their nature have a ton of sensitive data on it. Stuff like account numbers, stuff like potentially employee or potentially other officers data that isn't supposed to be public, social security numbers, that kind of stuff. Um, and somebody can get their hands on it if they get a hold of one of these hard drives that hasn't been wiped properly. So phones you can factory reset. Hard drives, there are commercial services that will wipe hard drives for you. Not very expensive. It's a good idea. It's just an extra little step that can prevent you from potentially having yourself getting yourself in a situation where one of your so some of your sensitive information has been compromised. Of course, that's not the only special consideration. If you're dealing with if your township happens to own spraying equipment. Dealing with thinking about the environmental necessity of where a disposal is supposed to go. Is this thing contaminated? How do we tell? What do we do with it? It's just as part of the inventory process, thinking through the implications of each particular piece of property as it comes through is important. How are we going to get rid of this thing? When do we know that it's time? Okay, so we recommend adopting an inventory policy, which should be pretty simple and just what's going to get inventoried, who's going to be maintaining it, how often are we reviewing this, how often are we checking to make sure that it's current, and how are we how are we documenting disposal. So the goal here when we're doing this, maintaining this thing over time, is consistency in the face of changing boards and consistency in the face of changing employees. The idea is to make it as easy as possible for future folks to figure out what exactly belongs to the public. Is that particular chainsaw a supervisor's that he's been using to help us out, or is it ours? If something's been living in our town hall for long enough, that can be pretty difficult to tell. But all right, so that is presentation here. Let me go ahead and check. Okay. Does that mean you can hold an auction for the fire truck? Yeah. So you have to comply with Minnesota. Minnesota's uniform municipal contracting law, assuming that you're dealing with something that's above $175,000. Um, the default rule, they've done that little hokey pokey thing, right? The default rule has to be there has to be proper notice and there has to be sealed bids. However, a fire truck is probably equipment within the meaning of that section. So long as you've got yourself a situation where you've got an open and online environment, it's interactive, people are competing to purchase the thing, you can probably get away with using some form of interactive auction for that. Now, you do have an independent duty as a public officer to make sure you're getting the best price for your money. Just dropping the thing on eBay is probably not your best practice there. There are specialized sites that sell heavy equipment in a variety of places. So that's kind of the first place that I'd take a look at. You always can go through the ordinary notice and bid process if you think you might get a better price that way. And for something as expensive as a fire truck, I mean, that one is absolutely worth taking the time to make sure you get that one absolutely right here. So, okay. Sorry about the little difficulties at the beginning here. Can an officer purchase the township's equipment from an auction house? That's an astute question, Gussie. So that prohibition doesn't have any procedural escape clauses at all. Now, as a practical matter, particularly if we're dealing with eBay, right, there's very little chance that we'd be able to catch somebody who as an officer, decided to place a bid on one of these things. It's open, it's public, everybody is pseudonymous. There's nearly no chance that we catch it. So, I think that they probably, if they were to do something like that, they probably have committed a misdemeanor. If we find out, we should not sell to them. Um, if you notice what the legislature did when they did that sleight of hand, that they said employees. So first, you can only sell to a public officer under the terms and conditions laid out in 15.054. And second, 15.054 says employees, not officers, can buy if they do it according to this auction process. Um, so, frankly, that sort of thing is, I don't, it's an older law, and I don't know that they've updated it for the eBay era because, quite frankly, if the officer's buying under the same terms and conditions as anybody else, it's hard to see what the moral problem there would be, really. Nevertheless, I think it's probably a misdemeanor. I'd strongly recommend against it. If you figure out that it's an officer bidding on this thing, I think you can't sell it to him. So I would not try it. Um, Now, there is an exception that applies to both officers and employees that are related to things that are sold in the normal course of business. So, it's not a crime for say the county commissioner if there's a county fairgrounds owned by the county where public employees are, running the beer garden or whatever, or running some sort of stand. That is not a violation. If it's part of the ordinary course of business offered in the same terms as the rest of the public, that doesn't cover the auction piece. So that's probably more information than you wanted, but there you go. All right. Well, thank you very much for your time and attention, and have a lovely Tuesday morning.